They don't want to be responsible for their own body, their own health, their own fitness. And I say this as somebody who was in that category for quite some time, and I'm battling back from it. I started to mention in either the last video or the first one, I mentioned about changing habits. I know I tried to talk about this in the videos that ended up getting cut for sound issues, but I wanted to talk a little bit about habits. It's something that I'm learning now, anew, and nobody ever taught me this specific thing. My mother was always the boss. My mother ran the show. So I never really had to, per se. If we had events or, holidays or dinners or whatever, my mom ran the show. And she was a very domineering personality. Not so much these days, of course, but, she's turning 81. But at that time, she did everything. She structured, she organized, she set up. I didn't have to do it, so I never learned it. So now I'm learning these things, and so as I'm trying to approach this whole idea of getting healthier, I decided to attack things one at a time, because years ago, I used to go on all these different fad diets trying to lose weight, and my weight always yo-yoed and went up and down, and I was different sizes at different seasons and so forth, and I ended up with a closet full of 3 or 4 sizes of clothing, some of which I'm still trying to get rid of, but I've gotten rid of a lot of them. And when I started to make these changes, I tell you what triggered me. Okay, now I was seeing these different little patterns with my body as I was gently coming up in years. Gently coming up in years, I like that. Anyway, I mentioned the tinnitus, and one of the side effects of the tinnitus was that I temporarily lost some hearing in my ears. And I didn't know it was related to the tinnitus, and I ended up being late to work a few times on account of that until I figured this out. And I had to get a doctor's note and everything because I could not hear the alarm in the morning. So when I decided to make this change, all these little symptoms and things were coming up, and I was, like I said, connecting the dots because I was trying to figure out what the heck is going on with my body. And I've been reading different books, and I always had an interest in natural health and healing. Since I was at least 14 years of age or so, I started drifting in that direction. And the thing is, at that age, it was like God spoke in my spirit and told me that I had a healing gift. And I think that is what sparked my interest in natural health and healing. It didn't manifest in me fully until years later. And the first time I saw the manifestation of it was when my youngest brother, who's now passed away, when my youngest brother first went in the hospital with a major health problem. And my mother called me and said that he had pneumonia, and he was at her house, and his wife and him were separated at that time, and his emotional state was that he was fairly angry and bitter against her for a variety of reasons. And she also was angry with him. And so he was staying for a while with my mom. And he had collapsed at her house, and she had taken him to the hospital. They had admitted him. and he had pneumonia. Now, while he was in the intensive care unit, my mother had been talking to the doctors. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but my mother was formerly a nurse. And she was sold out on everything the doctor said, and she did not believe in natural healing at all. And so the doctor's word was like gold to her. You know, that's programming in my mind. And so she called me at work after he had first gone to the hospital. She was with him, and then like 2 or 3 days later, when it really got serious and she got really scared, she called me at the job I was at then, and she was in tears and telling me that he had collapsed, he had pneumonia, and it wasn't looking good. And that the doctors were saying that all his major organs were shutting down and that there was nothing they could do. So at the time, I said, okay, you know, she was on the phone with me. She was a nervous wreck. She was crying and all hysterical. And I told her, Mom, you've got to choose who you're going to believe. Either you're going to stand in faith and believe God, or you're going to believe the doctors. Which is it going to be? And she started protesting and giving me, you know, excuses as to why she should, you know, consider what the doctors were telling her. And I said, Mom, you got to choose. Either you're going to trust God or you're going to trust the doctors. Which is it going to be? So she finally said, okay, she's going to trust God. So I said, then stand on that. If you pray, pray with a firm standing on that. So I left work, and I called, well, before I left work, I called my sister-in-law because I wanted to see kind of where her head was at about the whole thing and whether or not she was standing in faith on this or not. So when I called her, I was so happy to find that she understood what was going on. And she said to me, Sandy, I really believe that God is bringing him to his knees to remind him of what's important. And I said, okay, then we're on the same page, because just like when I had spoken to my mother, you know, and she told me all this, I didn't get, like in my spirit, I didn't freeze up. You know, I didn't get nervous and I didn't get scared that we were going to lose my brother. And that's typically what everybody else was doing. The minute they heard that he was in the hospital and it was serious, everybody's like, you know, it's like a cold, clammy hand clutched their hearts, and everybody, oh no, you know, we're going to lose Guy. When my mother gave me the news, I didn't get anything like that in my spirit. It was just in my mind, okay, Lord, you know, you're straightening him out. That was the only thing that came to me was, okay, you're getting him straight, you're getting his mind right or whatever. I don't get any sensation or any feeling that he's going anywhere. And this is what I told my mother. Mom, I'm not feeling in my spirit like he's going anywhere. He's not leaving us. This is the Lord dealing with him. His wife said the exact same thing. And she said she had spoken to her sister, and her sister also said the same thing. So she, her sister, and I were all in agreement. My mother was a little bit there, but the three of us were solidly in agreement on this. So I told her, let's get together and go to the hospital, since she hadn't been able to go because of the kids. My mom agreed to keep the kids, and she and I went. Now this happened, my brother passed in 2012. This happened 7 years prior. So this happened in 2005. And God graced him with 7 more years with his children and his wife. So at that time, she and I went to the hospital, and it irked me to see everyone there and the fear that they came in with, okay? They all came in there, oh, we're praying for him, we're praying, but they were praying from a position of fear. And I thought to myself, how can those prayers be successful? for lack of a better term. How can those prayers be answered when fear is behind them? And even as I say this now, it smacks me in my face because I'm thinking about current situations that I've had fear about and I've prayed about from a space of being in fear. But it's a weird dynamic. It's like I said to my pastor today that my spirit is telling my mind that this particular thing that I heard about from this lady, this particular amazing blessing that happened to her, could happen to me as well. My spirit is telling my mind this, trying to reprogram my mind into believing it. And my mind doesn't believe I'm worthy of it. But my spirit is telling my mind, okay, granted, you in and of yourself may not be worthy, but Christ lives in you and he makes you worthy. He is worthy and he makes you worthy. So while my spirit and my mind are having this conversation and my mind is trying to believe it and accept it, at the same time that that's happening, my body is resisting and my body is doing like this, like it's fighting with me. And it was such a weird dynamic to experience that today. A little upsetting, but it was weird. And I wasn't sure how to handle it. So I don't make this comment about the people that came in to my brother's room with that fear. I don't make that comment in judgment. It's just an observation concerning expectation. Because even when I pray in fear, if I have that mustard seed of hope or that mustard seed of faith, then the prayer can be successfully answered. And sometimes I don't even have that. I have to rely on, really, in all honesty, I have to rely on his faith because my faith is just not strong enough. It's just not enough. So, but it's funny because the same thing, I was reading the same thing in this book that I want to share with you, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but I was reading the same thing in that book where, when this lady got sick, everybody came in and they prayed, and she even stated it. They prayed from the fear that like clutched their hearts. And I'm like, wow. But how much more powerful would it be to pray from faith and from a place of non-judgment. In other words, if God decided to take her, particularly, I'm talking about the lady in the book now, if God had decided to take her home, sometimes when someone that's in the church that we know passes, we want to know why, and somehow we think that somewhere along the line that person must have failed in their faith. But that's rather arrogant to assume that, or to think that, or to even question why God would allow that person to leave this life, because it could be just their time. And maybe their time was to live up to this point, if it's 40 years or whatever. That was their time span given from the jump, and they maxed out, or maybe their purpose had been fulfilled and it was time for them to leave. People dealing with grief, want to know that why. But what I'm saying is that with regard to my brother, like I said, there was a lot of people that showed up at that hospital. A lot of people. I was stunned. And yes, he came through that first time. But I truly believe that it was not necessarily the fear-based prayers that pulled him through, but the faith-based prayers. That's what I believe. It aggravated me to come into the room and see the television on over his bed. He's in ICU. He's out cold. What does television need to be on for? To send negative messages into his subconscious? But of course, my dad put the television on. Typical. So, so when we came in, when his wife and I showed up at the hospital, there was, like I said, this whole air of fear and the negativity that fear brings. And she and I came in with a totally different perspective, and her sister came in with us in spirit because she was in agreement with us. So the two of us, there was nobody else in the room. We made sure everybody else came out of the room. The two of us began praying over my brother. And I started first. And this is the point in which this healing gift that God told me about activated. This was the first time that I saw evidence of it. And this happened before I became a massage therapist. So I started praying for him first. And when I went to pray for him, because they said all his organs and his systems were shutting down, I put my hand, extended my hand over his abdominal cavity, and I've extended it over his head because I said, well, his mindset needs to get right. And when I started praying for him, what came out of me, the words that came out of me, were not typically the way I pray. So I knew that was not me doing the speaking. It didn't sound like me. I mean, I'm not saying vocally it didn't sound like me. It didn't sound like what I typically would have said. And this prayer happened, it seemed to me like about 20 minutes. And while I was praying for him, there was an intense heat coming from my hands down to his body, to his abdominal area and to his head. So intense. We're in a freezing cold ICU room. And the heat coming out of me was so intense towards him that he was sweating profusely in a freezing cold ICU room. And then after I finished praying for him, the heat stopped and I paused, and I was by the side of the bed, and his wife started praying over him as well. And then when she stopped and the whole aura of prayer had been finished, at that moment, I started to collapse. I started to fall down, and I had to grab the side railing on the bed because I didn't know it until after the prayer had been done, but my brother had sucked. I say the word sucked, but I mean like pulled. My brother had pulled so much energy from me. And I don't even say it was my energy. I believe it was, God flowing through or whatever, but he pulled so much energy out of me that literally I was weak and I started falling. And I couldn't walk. I had to grab the railing, not only of the bed, but of the entire hospital, the walls, the hallways, all the way as his wife and I was leaving. I was clutching the rails because I was so weak, I could barely walk. I could barely move. And I told her, I leaned on her coming out to the car, and I told her, hey, when I get home, I'm going to have to go right to bed because, oh my gosh, like I feel so zapped. I'm so exhausted. But the day after she and I prayed over him, he fully recovered. And he was not conscious. Like I said, his organs, his systems, everything was supposed to be failing. And he had no consciousness whatsoever when we were there. But he was awake and he was fine the next day. And the doctors were amazed because they said if he happened to survive this, he would have to be on like dialysis and a whole bunch of different drugs and stuff for the rest of his life. He came out of that episode having to take maybe one tablet. That was it. And like I said, God ended up gracing him with another 7 years. But that was the first occasion that I saw evidence of the healing gift that God mentioned to me. And then once I became a massage therapist, then I really saw it starting to manifest. But I'm looking at the time now, and I think I'm going to stop on this particular video, and I will get back to you on the next one. Please like, please subscribe, please share, and also please feel free to support me at patreon.com/Cross of Pain. Please feel free to join us on my Facebook page at Cross of Pain, and right there you'll see the button to join the group if you would like. And until I talk to you again, peace and blessings to you.